This is Unit 2, the arrangement of space and design choices. It's going to teach you the basic implementation of the elements and principles as well as how to use visual hierarchy. In Unit 2, Part 1, we're going to be talking about the basic implementation of the elements and principles. We've already discussed the elements and principles of design, the elements being the building blocks of your design that you're creating, and the principles is how you actually organize those elements throughout the space to make a successful design. So in this mini lesson in Part 1, we're going to be talking about 5 tips that you can think about as you organize your design space. Tip number 1, use scale and variety to add depth or interest in your design. So looking at this example here on the right-hand side with the whale and the scuba diver, thinking about how big a whale actually is in real life, and looking at the value of both the whale and the scuba diver, it wouldn't make sense that the scuba diver is as big as the whale in this scene. This would mean that the whale would be very far out in the distance, but really there's nothing telling us that visually. So if we look at the second one, the scale and size are not only more interesting to look at, but they make more sense. Both the whale and the diver are on the same plane of space, but the diver is much smaller to add more interest to this scene, and it just makes more sense visually. Number 2, use color to create contrast. Okay? Contrast are opposites. So we talked about how opposite colors on the color wheel are the most contrasting colors. The most contrasting values are going to be black and white. You can also create contrast by using any of the other elements of design. So for example, maybe the size of shapes. If you have a smaller shape and a bigger shape, you're going to naturally be drawn to the bigger shape, unless maybe the color is a brighter, bolder color that contrasts for the smaller shape. So looking at our example here of the before and after, you can see that the little man in the middle with the hands raised up in the air is the one that is different out of all of these little men that are standing. But it doesn't stand out. You barely notice that it's different. So looking at the second example where the intensity of that color is increased, it really does pop off the background. And here's our color wheel just for the reference I was talking about before. Notice that the colors across from each other are going to really create contrast. Here are all of our complementary colors. You can think about sports teams, you can think about holidays. Those are typically in those categories. Number 3, use your negative and positive space well. So in this lesson, I talked about previously the negative space being just as important as the positive space. Well, you also want to use that negative space to your advantage whenever you can. So looking at this first example here of the astronaut and the moon or planet, you can see that there really isn't a lot of negative space. The subject is really the astronaut and the moon. The negative space is going to be the space around, which we have almost none. There's really no benefit to what you're seeing here. Well, in the second example, there's what is referred to before as an implied line. An implied line is an imaginary line that draws your eye across the plane. Well, the diver or astronaut here is going to be looking directly at the planet. That eyesight line carries your eye naturally across this negative space, and it's just much more interesting set up like this than it was originally with no negative space really at all. So much better solution here. You can also see that variation of size that we just saw with the diver and the whale above, where the planet is just a little bit smaller. It's running off the plane on the rule of thirds, and the astronaut is actually bigger and in the foreground. Here's another great example, maybe from creating a logo, where the negative space works. There's really not a lot of awkward negative space here, but by combining the objects and creating a shape within the negative space, it just becomes much more interesting to look at and works together really, really well. Number 4, use the idea of shape and form to change perspective. So looking at our drawing on the left-hand side, you can see this man working at his desk. Depending on what I'm trying to be advertising or saying with this image, maybe I'm talking about the work that he's actually doing or the organization of his workspace. Well, this solution wouldn't work as well as our second solution where we could see the top of the desk. So think about the three-dimensional form of the actual item that you're drawing two-dimensionally. Is there a better solution for a different perspective that you can take to make the design work better with what you are actually trying to say as an artist? And finally, number 5, limit your color palette to create unity. I mentioned before, Adobe Color is a wonderful app. I definitely recommend checking that out. I definitely use it. It gives you some really cool examples of color harmonies that you can use. It also lets you create your own using this first tool here. So I definitely would check that out. But it's important to limit your colors in your design no matter what. As you start creating a graphic design, I would try to stick to 3 colors max, and then if you have to add a couple extra, that could work. But the less, the better to make your design look uniform, and it's automatically going to make it look continuous and nice and unified if you limit those colors. So talking about the color options here in Adobe, we have analogous, which are going to be typically 3 colors right next to each other on the color wheel. Monochromatic are going to be 1 color, but then all of its shades and tints. Shades and tints are adding black or white to that color. So it's 1 single color with black and white added to it. If you add black to a color, it's called a shade. If you add white to a color, it's called a tint. A really good way to remember that is if you're outside on a really sunny day and you're sitting underneath a tree, you are in the shade. It's darker in the shade. So you can think about adding the black to a color, that it's a shade, and white to a color, that it's a tint. So that's monochromatic. Triadic are 3 evenly spaced colors on the color wheel. Complementary, we've talked about already, are right across from each other on the color wheel. And split complementary is going to be right across, but it splits the 2 next to it. So these are really good ones to think about right now as we're getting started in graphic design. Definitely recommend checking this out.